Welcome to CNI Jerusalem Calling, your source for unfiltered Mideast talk radio. I'm your host for today's program. My name is Robert Keeley. I spent 34 years in the U.S. diplomatic service, ending up as ambassador to Mauritius, then Zimbabwe, and then Greece. That doesn't sound like much about the Middle East, but actually I was president of the Middle East Institute after retirement for 4 years. And I was born in Lebanon. My father was the American consul at the time. My two older brothers, were born in Damascus, his previous assignment. And my first overseas post was Jordan, and that's when I became interested in the Palestinian problem. Our guest today is Mark Perry. He's a military intelligence and foreign policy analyst and the co-director of Conflicts Forum, an international political advocacy organization. He's the author of 6 critically acclaimed books, and his articles have appeared in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and Newsday. He served as the editor of Washington City Paper and as the editor of The Veteran, the largest circulation newspaper for veterans in this country. He helped research and write the BBC's award-winning documentary titled The Intelligence War Against Iraq in 1991 and has appeared regularly on CNN's The International Hour, Special Assignment, and the Saturday and Sunday morning news shows. Are you there, Mark?
Sure am. Good to be here.
You broke the story of the Petraeus briefing, as it's come to be called, as a result of your article. The first order of business ought to be for you to tell us something about that story that you wrote for Foreign Policy magazine, because some of our listeners may not be aware of it. I think it's been a landmark event in the history of Palestinian-Israeli relations and U.S.-Israeli relations and so forth.
For foreignpolicy.com, I wrote an article called The Petraeus Briefing. It came out several weeks ago. It was a controversial piece that got a lot of attention. It tells the story of how General Petraeus sent a briefing team here to the Pentagon last January to brief the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about America's military posture in the region, and they reported to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that the continued lack of progress in the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiation and continued Israeli intransigence on that issue was actually undermining America's military posture in the region and endangering American soldiers' lives. The briefing was very short, 45 minutes, 33 slides given by members of General Petraeus' staff. I was given the information by officers on the Joint Staff about who was present, and I reported that Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was surprised and stunned by the briefing, but that Petraeus' briefers were pretty adamant about their conclusion. It makes sense. The lack of progress, Israeli intransigence, the deepening crisis between Israel and the United States has all had an impact on the war on terrorism and what we're doing in the Middle East. And Israel has, for quite a while, had that impact on our Middle East posture. That came out in about 3 weeks ago, and it caused a firestorm of criticism. And I agree with you. I think it changed the narrative a little bit. It's now common to draw a direct link between Israeli intransigence and the difficulties we're having in the Middle East.
I certainly agree with you that it was a signal event, primarily because of its content, but also going back to President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, who told us about the military-industrial complex. That is probably the biggest lobby in Washington. We live inside the Beltway, are quite aware of that, but I'm not sure other people are. We have the Israeli lobby. We have lots of other lobbies, the medical insurance lobby, doctors, lawyers, and so forth. But the military, the senior military, getting involved in a very serious issue of foreign policy, and that, to me, is new. They rarely speak out in this manner.
Yeah, that's right. But as you say, we have a lot of lobbies in Washington. Some of them are quite powerful. The gun lobby, as you noted, the health insurance lobby, the Israeli lobby is extremely powerful. But when the military weighs in on a question, they outweigh every other lobby, and I would argue every other lobby combined. And this is the way I think about it. If the head of AIPAC were to call the President of the United States, the President may or may not pick up the phone. But when General Petraeus or a senior commander in the U.S. military calls the President in the Oval Office, the President answers the phone. These senior military commanders, and I'm not a cynic on this point, I believe this absolutely. These senior military commanders have to look at American casualty lists every day, and it bothers them. And it's their job not just to win conflicts and to protect our country, but to protect the individual soldiers that are out there. And if there's something endangering those soldiers, they get the first hearing in the Oval Office and not AIPAC. So AIPAC is powerful, it's important, it weighs in on behalf of Israel, but it cannot match the kind of power that a person like General Petraeus has.
Well, I think the last point is very important. General Petraeus has a sterling reputation. I mean, he has credibility. He's spoken of as the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I've heard him speak in public. He's usually rather guarded and follows the official line. And for him to put his name or have his name put on this kind of démarche to the president, no matter how it got there, gives enormous impact, I think.
That's exactly right. General Petraeus has great stature, both in the American public and inside the military. He was instrumental in dampening the kind of violence we saw in Iraq. He speaks very carefully. This man is hardly a radical. When he sends us key staffers, senior staffers from the Middle East to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and says that the lack of progress in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is harming our interests, people sit up and notice, and they did it in the military in January, and they did it when I reported the article 3 or 4 weeks ago.
I'm wondering if you can tell us what the impact has been within the administration, that is on the president and his foreign policy team or his national security team. It's bound to have had an impact, but do we have any information on how it was received there? I'd kind of draw a blank because I don't think our media have covered that aspect of it very well.
The article came out, I think the date is March 14th. I knew it would cause some controversy, but I had no idea it would be as explosive as it turned out to be. It came out on a Sunday morning in foreignpolicy.com, and immediately the Sunday morning talk shows focused on it, and David Axelrod, one of the president's assistants, was asked about the impact of Israeli intransigence and Israeli stubbornness and lack of movement on our security in the region. And he checked off all the boxes and said the right words that you always say if you're with an administration about Israel. Well, we remain committed to Israel's security. We're working hard on the Israeli-Palestinian peace conflict. And I'm paraphrasing here, but there's no question that the lack of progress here has an impact on the way people think about us in the region. So this became immediately in the press a focus of public concern and of policymaking concern. One of the things that I was very interested in seeing was that the next Tuesday, that is 3 days after the article appeared, General Petraeus was before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and in his public testimony, the lack of progress in the Israeli-Palestinian peace front was the number one challenge that he listed that the United States faces in the region. Now, has it changed policy? Changing policy is like trying to melt a glacier in Washington. It doesn't happen that often, and it's very difficult to do. And I wouldn't claim that the article changed policy, but I think that it changed the narrative. Now, when you read the New York Times, Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, LA Times, Time Magazine, Newsweek, they always include, as a part of their reporting, this concern about American stature in the region and the impact of the peace process in that stature. So to that degree, there has been a policy shift. It is now in Israel's court to say they care as much about our security as we care about theirs. We always hear this. Hillary Clinton says this. We remain committed to Israel's security. Well, that's not the issue. The issue is, are they committed to ours? And people are now starting to ask that question.
I'd like to pick up on that a little bit. There are rumors going around here that this Petraeus briefing and all that's associated with it has caused a re-examination of our whole policy on that issue that's going on internally, and we're not privy to it, of course. But I'm wondering if you've heard anything to that effect, whether that might produce something brand new in trying to find peace in the Middle East, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
There are reports that there's a rethink going on in the White House about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. My understanding is that last week the president had a number of discussions with his national security team and even with outside Middle East experts on next steps in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This hasn't been decided yet, but there were reports that President Obama and the administration would put on the table their vision of what constitutes a credible and legitimate resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think this goes back to a paper given to the administration by Henry Siegman and a team of Middle East experts that he put together on what the administration should do. And I talked to Henry about this about a year and a half ago, and he said, it's time for the United States to put on the table its vision of what would constitute a legitimate and credible resolution of this conflict. This has been characterized in the Israeli press as imposing peace. I wouldn't go that far. I think rather this is setting out a marker for Palestinians and Israelis about what the United States believes would be just in resolving this conflict. I think we're a ways away from that actually happening, but the administration is considering it. I think it would be a very good step. It would clear out some of the clutter we've been hearing since the appearance of my article from the Israelis, that they'll never give up Jerusalem, that they have a right to build the settlements, and all this stuff. This has never been their right. This conflict has now hung on for 50 years. I think it's time for the United States and the Obama administration in particular to intervene more substantively.
My opinion is that the United States not only has a right but has an obligation to propose what they think would be a viable, acceptable, just solution. If that's imposing it, well, I wouldn't use that term. We're putting it on the table for the sides to consider. Now, we have a call from James in Los Angeles.
Thank you very much for taking my call. Mr. Perry, did you receive the email that I forwarded you yesterday that was received by General Petraeus? Sent a reply to me, actually. And I beg to differ with regard to how much influence, although I very much respect your article with regard to having it appear at foreignpolicy.com. But we've seen this kind of thing earlier with General Zinni. He had basically said, even on 60 Minutes, that we'd gone to war in Iraq for Israel. That was a factor in that. And we saw what happened to him. He was basically, and that was obviously during the Bush neocon regime, but he had a lot of courage to say what he did then. And I have this email that was received by General Petraeus, and again, I forwarded it to you yesterday. And he basically is denying that he even said that about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's basically telling neocon Max Boot, and you can read about him in Pat Buchanan's Who's War article for the American Conservative. He still has a lot of influence, obviously. The neocons have a lot of influence on General Petraeus, perhaps because he's running for president. We don't know that for sure yet, but he seems to be from that email, posturing himself. But the bottom line is that he doesn't even have the courage, based on that email, by the look of it, to even stand behind what was conveyed in the posture report. He's basically telling Max Boot in this email that he didn't even say it, and it was just written down. And I'll close with this. A good friend of mine, Dr. Steven Snagosky, has written the Transparent Cabal book, which is actually the best book on how we got into the Iraq quagmire. He said, we can talk about influence and all this, and again, it's much appreciated, but AIPAC and the Zionist Organization of America, which is just bragging now that it has so much influence on the American government, they still win the day. And I don't see in an election year how Obama's going to cave into either of those entities. Thank you for your time.
James, thanks. I did receive your email. I've been reflecting on what you had to say. It was a very substantive and long email, and there's a lot there that James has been doing a lot of work out in L.A. on this, and I do have some responses. After the appearance of my article, General Petraeus gave testimony, but then saying that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was key to helping our posture in the region. But then he seemed to back off of that. And he said that he never had said the statements attributed to him. Well, the truth is I never attributed any statements to him. So he's backing off something he never said. He seems to be moving backwards as much as he can. He wrote to Max Boot, a neocon, denying everything. The briefing happened. It's never been denied. I received a call from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff office. They said the briefing took place, that I characterized it correctly, and the story is right. And other reporters, including reporters at the Washington Post, have confirmed my story. So that's not in doubt, regardless of what General Petraeus says. But he's been very careful in his denials. And he's never really totally backed off the briefing or said that it never happened. But it is also clear he would like this controversy to go away. And James is absolutely right about that. He's under a lot of fire because of this. I will take issue with James, and I think we can legitimately disagree on this while agreeing on almost everything else. There have been fundamental shifts in American foreign policy thinking since the time of General Zinni and the neocons. And the first thing is the publication of the Israel Lobby, the Mearsheimer-Walt book, and the publication of Jimmy Carter's book on Israel, Peace Not Apartheid. And there has been a shift in American thinking. And I think that there is a growing groundswell of public opinion that wants America to move away from what I call its Israel obsession. There are other countries in the Middle East outside of Israel, and they are friends and allies of ours, and we have to pay attention to their concerns. Israel is one country. The Israelification of America, as I call it, after 9/11 was a terrible mistake for this country. Going into Iraq was a terrible mistake for this country. We can agree or disagree on whether we did that for Israel, but we have larger, more important issues to deal with than to every single day come out and say, well, we love Israel, we're committed to Israel, we love Israel's security, we want to do what's right for Israel. That's only part of the issues that we face in the region. We have to start paying attention to the whole region. I don't think General Petraeus would disagree with that.
We have another question, this time from David.
Yes, sir. I have two questions, one shorter and one longer, and I'll try to keep both brief. The first question is this 33-slide, 45-minute PowerPoint briefing available anywhere where the public can look at it?
No.
And the second is the lopsided relationship, Israel obsession you just said, has gone back as far as Truman, and there's been other incidents like Suez Canal and the USS Liberty and the Iraq War itself. Is this really the first time that any U.S. military person has ever complained about that lopsided relationship, or is this just the first time we've ever heard about it?
No, the briefing is not available to the public, and I don't believe it will be. And the answer to the second question is military officers have regularly, since the founding of Israel, questioned America's commitment to Israel and its obsession with Israel, and have always focused on shaping a more balanced policy towards Israel. You'll find this from Secretary of State and General George Marshall all the way to David Petraeus, including Dwight Eisenhower, and even in the Johnson and Nixon administrations, people questioning our lack of balance in this relationship. But it rarely goes public. This is the one time that I can remember over the last 20 years that it's been so public.
This is Robert Keeley again. When I was talking about myself at the beginning, I failed to mention that my association here is I'm the chairman of the board of the Council for the National Interest Foundation, which is the sponsor of these programs. But I'd like to give a bit of a plug for our organization. If you want to learn more about our CNI, Council for the National Interest, we have a website, www.cnionline.org. We also have a blog, which is entitled Fair Policy, Fair Discussion. You can find archived copies of the radio shows, on our website. And the blog, Fair Policy, Fair Discussion, is available by just typing in Fair Policy, Fair Discussion, and you'll get there. We have another question, this time from Preston.
Yes. Hello, Mark.
Hello.
I'm sure you're probably familiar with a gentleman named Andrew Bacevich over at Boston University.
Yes.
He's given quite a bit of information, this former West Point fella. He's often pointed out the distinction between the mindset of military command in the United States and that of the political body.
Yes.
My question is, when we hear people like Petraeus make statements such as these, I mean, this is pretty serious. Why hasn't the Israeli-Palestinian issue been grouped in with military command out of CENTCOM in the first place? I haven't really understood. I don't know if you know much about why
I do.
The Israeli-Palestinian issue has been grouped with Eurocom, actually, is my question.
Yes. The listeners may not know, so let me just explain it. There are unified commands, military commands, regional commands around the world. I think there are 7 of them. And CENTCOM, Central Command, includes, I think it is 29 Arab states. And General Petraeus is the head of CENTCOM, the commander of CENTCOM. EUCOM is the European command, includes all the European states, and it is under the direction of a 4-star officer, the same rank as General Petraeus. You would think that Israel, being in the Middle East, would be grouped with CENTCOM and not with EUCOM. But that's not the case, and that's the heart of the listener's question. Why is Israel with EUCOM? And there is actually a fairly good reason for that. Foreign military assistance is handled in part and monitored by the military commanders, and it was thought that Israel being a part of CENTCOM with Arab states would lead to deep arguments that would focus on the military command between who gets what, and that Israel would be privy to the details of foreign military assistance programs to the Arab states and would argue against them to the same commander who's monitoring those assistance programs. So Israel was put in EUCOM to separate Israel from those kinds of arguments, which is a fairly good reason. The difficulty here is that the West Bank and Gaza are also in EUCOM, and they have no business being in EUCOM. And General Petraeus has asked the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I wrote that he asked the president. That's not the case. He made a request to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the West Bank and Gaza be put in the Central Command, and that request was ignored or denied. And if it was in CENTCOM, then it would give our military a greater role and give General Petraeus a greater role and a greater voice in the foreign policy decision-making on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I think that the request ought to be acceded to, but I'm not privy to the policy thinking on this. The question itself shows the degree of difficulty and the kind of controversy that a lack of progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can cause in all levels of government, including in our military.
I'm going to shift to a slightly different subject now, and that's Iran. I read an op-ed piece by an Arab writer at the Palestine Center in which he argued that there is no way Iran is going to use nuclear weapons against Israel. After all, 20% of the population of Israel is Palestinians, and many of them would be killed in such an attack. And so he was arguing that really it's Israel that's creating this Iran problem because they like to have enemies. If they don't have enemies, then they can't justify all that they spend and we spend on military equipment and arms and so forth. It was a new idea to me that Iran's nuclear program, if there is such a program, is basically defensive. It's a deterrent. It's not because they plan to wipe out Israel.
Well, I don't know. I don't think any of us know, except we do know this. Iran exports and is forced to also burn off its own energy resources, which could be its primary income. And they're in economic trouble. They could use this export, and their lack of energy inside their own country has forced them to use energy that they could potentially export and make money. They want a nuclear program to create energy inside of Iran. This is their first priority, not making a nuclear weapon. They may or may not make a nuclear weapon at some point once they master the enrichment cycle, but they haven't done that yet. We tend to look at anybody who wants nuclear power, and especially a country like Iran, as wanting it for pernicious reasons, and that's not necessarily the case with Iran. But I think you make a very good point here. It's not clear to me that the Iran issue is issue number one for the United States in the region. In my talks with military commanders, they put Afghanistan, Iraq, the peace process, terrorism, ahead of Iran's nuclear program. The Iranians are, in fact, quite a ways from producing a nuclear weapon. In Israel, it's issue number one. And the political establishment in Israel uses the Iran issue to divert attention, I believe, from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's also almost a form of blackmail on the part of the Netanyahu government. They'll say to the Obama administration, listen, we could take care of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. We can resolve our problems with the Palestinians. But first, we need to focus on Iran. Well, we've noticed through the years that Israel always does this. There's always a reason not to deal with the peace process. There's always a reason not to deal with the Palestinians. And the current reason for not doing it is Iran. It is almost a form of blackmail to tell the administration, you deal with Iran, and then we'll deal with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And what we need to do is separate the two issues. They are very distinct.
I certainly agree with you, Mark. The thing that I think could solve this problem is if Iran would be a bit more cooperative with inspectors. If their really primary objective is nuclear power for their own economy, which I agree with you is probably the uppermost priority, they should be willing to have the inspectors come and look at it. I think that could defuse it. In any case, I think a war with Iran, over Iran, against Iran would be an utter disaster on top of all of the other problems we've got in Iraq and Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, and so forth. Iran is a rather advanced country, and they're not going to go down without a fight. So I really think it would be a mistake. I wonder if you could outline for us what you would feel could be a successful resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict. My own feeling is that there was a very good start back in 2002 when the Arab League adopted a proposal. It was ratified by all 22 members, including the Palestinians. This was when Yasser Arafat was alive. And it subsequently has been approved by 56 or 76, I don't know how many Muslim countries, and it seems eminently workable, but it apparently never got onto the table to be considered.
The Saudi government, King Abdullah, which made the proposal, was in exchange for a full peace and a full resolution of the conflict. There would be full diplomatic relations between the Arab states and Israel. That plan remains on the table, and why the Obama administration ignores it is a puzzle to me. I'm not a one-state solution person. I believe in a two-state solution, although I think in the ideal world, one secular state with Israelis and Palestinians is very doable. I think it's probably impractical at this point. So I'm a two-state person with Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state, along the lines of the 67 borders, 242 and 338. And I'm one of the few people that I know that is adamant about the right of return. I believe in the right of return. I think it's very difficult for the Palestinians to give it up. People who are pushed out of their homeland have a right to go back. I know that would be difficult for Israel to swallow, but I think in principle the right of return needs to be confirmed, and that can be done without endangering what the Israelis call the Jewish character of their state. So I believe in a two-state solution. I would start, if I were the Obama administration, with the Taba Accords, which occurred right at the end of the Clinton administration, as a good starting point for a resolution of the conflict. People say, well, this is difficult, and it is difficult. It takes political will. But the one thing that Israel has to decide that they're going to have to do sooner or later, and sooner the better, is to end the occupation of Palestinian lands. And when they, in principle, declare that they will do that, I think we've made tremendous headway. That's my own view of the conflict.
I'm a two-state person also, and 67 borders, right of return, and all of that, but some of my colleagues have given up on that, are going for a one-state solution. I don't think that is workable or would ever be acceptable to the Israelis, because they would become the minority population eventually. As far as the right of return, I learned something from the Cyprus problem, which I've also worked on. The borders were opened not long ago, and some Greeks went from where they were living in the south up to Kyrenia and looked up their old houses, and they had so changed in character, the furnishings, the decorations, the whole place, because of course it's occupied by a Turkish family. They returned back south and said, I don't want to live there anymore. Maybe you need that shocking experience to make you decide, well, I think I would do better elsewhere. In other words, let people go back to where they lived, and if they can find it at all, they'll probably find that it's an apartment building now.
Yeah, I think that.
But maybe
right.
You have to go through that emotional experience of saying there isn't any home to return to. My home has disappeared, as has the whole village.
Yes.
It's a bit brutal, but maybe that's what people have to do.
I'm inclined to agree. I think that the shock of understanding how the country that was Palestine has been transformed so fundamentally is a shock that might be needed. I have spent a lot of time in Palestinian refugee camps, and this is almost a pillar of national belief, is this dream of the return, as if the olive groves are still there, and they're not there. I've spent some time in some Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, and I've said, the first priority is the right of return. Is there another place you would live? And they say, well, not here. And I say, what about the United States or Canada? And there's a long silence. I think that what's going to happen is the international community is going to have to come in here and take care of the refugee problem, perhaps by draining off the refugees and repatriating them. That's not quite the right word, but repatriating them to another place, the United States or Canada. I say to the Palestinians, welcome to the United States. You're going to be our neighbors, and, we need your educated populace here, and you can make up your mind to come to the United States. I wouldn't have any problem with that. If we really want a solution to this issue, let's get serious about it and not just talk about it and go in there and try and fix some of the problems.
I think the international community does have an obligation. After all, the United Nations created the partition plan. They created two states. One of them never came into being. Palestinians should be offered choices. Many of them are still in camps, not happy where they are, can't get jobs.
Right.
At least there would be a Palestinian state that they could assimilate with. culturally not different from what they used to have,
right.
And others immigrating to other countries. I think there is an obligation there.
The only thing that this really takes is political will. This problem can be resolved if there's political will. That's been the only thing lacking, but it is fundamental. We have the longest lived refugee population in the world in the Palestinians. I think it's an international scandal that they're still there and that we haven't resolved this conflict.
More than 60 years.
More than 60 years. Unbelievable.
That's a lifetime for somebody who's lived quite a long time.
There's a lot of opposition to our point of view still in the United States that people really don't focus on this issue. I can understand that. Our economy is in trouble. This isn't high on the priority of many Americans, but this is a festering wound, and it's really hurting our status around the world.
One of the interesting things about the Palestinian refugees, though, is that they have a very high standard of education because of UNRWA and the UN and so forth. Many of them have gotten very good educations. They're not unskilled labor immigrants. These would be professionals in a variety of fields and could contribute to the well-being of whatever country they end up in.
That's exactly right. And in general, the Palestinian people have always had a tradition, a national tradition of reaching high education standards. You and I know if you're in Gaza or the West Bank, during the national day of testing at the end of their high school year, the pressures on these students are intense, and the demands for academic excellence are very high in Palestinian society. They have traditionally been and historically been the most educated, most competent, most capable of the Arab peoples, and will brag, albeit very quietly, well, we built the oil wells, we provided the engineers. Where a Jewish mother would say, my son the doctor, the Palestinians joke that they say, my son the engineer, and that seems to be generally true of Palestinian society.
Mark, let me thank you for your help on this program. I really appreciate it. For your help on this program. I really appreciate it. For your help on this program.